Hello, welcome everyone to our 29th meetup. We're very excited. Today we're talking about feature flags. And in feature flags, they're more than just on-off switches, is what we're going to be aiming towards. And we're going to be talking about a lot of creative ways to use feature flags in your projects. We're going to talk about deployments. We're going to talk about running A/B tests. We're going to talk about a lot of other powerful features that you can make use of. And we also have people from the OpenFeature community. We have Kyle here from Flagsmith and Jonathan joining us from DevCycle. And yeah, if you're new to feature flags or if you just want to learn more, this stream is for you. And it's being recorded as well. It's being live streamed on all our platforms. So make sure you check out the links in the description and feel free to share your questions in the live chat. Let's kick off with some introductions. Kyle, do you want to go first, and then Jonathan?
Yeah, brilliant. Yep. So my name's Kyle. I'm a co-founder of Flagsmith. My background primarily is in front-end development. I've been developing web and mobile applications for the past 11 years. Which led me to the creation of Flagsmith. So yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jonathan, co-founder and CTO over here at DevCycle, obviously a feature flagging platform ourselves. Kind of been in this industry for about a decade now, across A/B testing and feature flagging with our previous product Taplytics, and now DevCycle. Also a member of the OpenFeature governance board, so happy to talk through OpenFeature as well.
Cool. And the reason we started planning for this stream was like there are a lot of feature flag organizations, companies, startups. So obviously, there's a big demand and a big use case for people. But before we get started, quickly, can we maybe do an introduction on feature flags? Like, if someone is not using feature flags, why should they do it? And what's the whole hype about? Maybe Jonathan go first, and then Kyle.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. So feature flags are really a way to sort of dynamically control your application at runtime, right? So I think every developer out there knows about environment variables and configuring your application. But what if you could make that configuration kind of dynamic and operate at runtime, right? Where you can say, hey, I'm shipping this new feature to my users, and I want to sort of like control who gets access to that feature. So say it's like a new beta feature that I'm launching, and I only want like internal users to maybe test it in production at the start. That's a very common use case. Or I want to sort of ship it to an initial beta test group of users. That's another very common use case. And so feature flags allow you kind of at runtime to control sort of who has access to different parts of your product, allow you to sort of roll out changes and deprecate changes easily, and allow you to do things like, hey, if something goes wrong, if some system or some feature is causing issues in production, you can like roll things back and turn things off without shipping new code. So it's really fundamentally a way of shipping software faster and more safely to production for teams that really use it. And it's really, I would say, like a development practice. Teams that adopt feature flagging as a core development practice tend to ship to production more frequently and more safely.
Brilliant. Yeah, I feel like we could spend the whole talk on this question, because it really is more than just turning features on and off. It's more than just Booleans. It is a development practice. I guess I'll answer this by saying, sort of prior to feature flagging, releasing code was a lot harder. A lot of things needed to happen before you got code in production, because you didn't have the safety net of a feature flag. Whereas now it kind of even changes the responsibility of the engineering versus QA versus product, where engineering can focus on pushing code to production under the safety net of a feature flag and not necessarily turning that feature on themselves and even when it gets turned on is completely up for debate and down to the sort of product owners and sort of QA team, and engineers can focus on writing code. And as well as that safety net, it provides sort of readiness to change. So, for example, if you had features that relied on third-party suppliers, a third-party supplier went down, you'd be quick to change and just turn off a feature flag rather than scramble, get a deployment, do a bug fix, and those sorts of things. So yeah, it completely changes the way people develop once they embrace it sort of properly, and sort of the nature of like pull requests building up, migrating towards trunk-based development, and all really good development practices.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And that's interesting because, like, if I take one example that was mentioned by Jonathan around, rollbacks. So when you are in such a situation when, let's say, you're using feature flags and it needs to be rolled back like really quickly in a live production environment. Let's say something got messed up and you're using feature flags and now you need to roll back. Like, how would you handle that situation? And maybe can you shed some light on specifically in this scenario how feature flags can be useful?
I think this is an important part of why it's like a development practice, not just a tool, because like if you're using feature flags as your core development practice, so like when you start building the new feature, that new functionality, you start with a feature flag as your first thing, so that everything downstream, all the changes downstream from that new feature and change that you're making to your code is behind that flag. It can really enable you to like have confidence that, hey, when I turn that flag off, that code path is actually going to turn off, right? And so that's why I think both of us really preach it as a development practice, because you can quickly get that safety of, hey, like I started with a feature flag, I shipped this early code to production and just tested it internally with my team, where I was able to turn on and off this feature and I could see that it worked or didn't work. And that gave me a lot of confidence that like, okay, once this feature is done and all that code is still behind a feature flag, if I ever needed to turn it off in production, we could do that safely. And that's why it's like, we believe it's very important to use feature flags not just as like a, hey, I've finished this coding up this feature, I'm going to slap sort of a feature flag together now at the end of it and like ship it to production. It's like, no, you should actually start with like setting up the feature flag first, and then writing all your code kind of behind that flag so that you have confidence later on if you actually need to roll it back really quickly. And the nice thing about all of our various platforms is we can all roll back features really quickly. A lot of us have like real-time update capabilities where we can turn things off globally in under a second. So you have that confidence where you can turn things off really quickly. You just have to make sure in your development practices that you're actually building with feature flags in mind, so that when you turn it off, it actually turns it off and doesn't cause other issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like a lot of the reason why I got into feature flags in the first place was from a large medical application that I was building, and releases were slow. They were sort of every like couple months, and releases sort of being a big deal and like turning back being so difficult introduced so much like anxiety into sort of doing releases. Whereas with feature flags, the process is simply, you've got the feature on in production, you find out something's wrong with it, you turn it off, you diagnose, you then have a choice as well. Like, what do you do then? You think you've solved the issue, but you don't want to sort of have an egg on your face where you turn it back on and all of a sudden, like, all the error rates go back on. So you can actually sort of control the reintroduction of that feature flag as well, either through incremental sort of increase in percentage-based rollouts, turning it on for individuals and turning it on for groups of people, and then going ahead and turning it back on for the wider user base. I think this is one thing that I've really got into as well, is reducing the likelihood of this app happening by testing in production. So prior to even your internal team seeing a feature flag in production, as an individual developer, as an individual QA, or as an individual end-to-end test suite, turning a feature on just for one user in production rather than your staging environment, because testing with real data and with real production code gives you a lot more sense of sort of calm and sort of stability and like being sure that the feature is stable. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting what you mentioned around it's a dev practice and not a tool. So obviously you need to communicate it across the teams that are involved in a project. Following up on that, like what are some of the strategies that you have found effective, when ensuring that your flags are properly documented and communicated across all the teams that are involved in your projects?
Who wants to take that? Shall I take that? Yeah, so I guess this is the one thing to be aware of, because you start out with feature flagging with just a small number of flags. You're getting used to sort of faster iteration and faster releases of your code, but soon that practice can lead to a sort of build up in flags. And you've really got to be mindful of that. And you can react to it if you haven't considered that from the get-go. But what I would advise is quite a few things around this. So standardizing a process around removal of flags, and that can differ by company. Maybe you have like a bi-weekly practice where you review stale flags. Some providers offer sort of automated sort of tagging of stale flags and sort of bringing that awareness to you. But then also sort of assigning ownership to the feature flags, because sorry, I think. Oh, hello. Sorry, I cut out a tiny bit there. Right, yes, assigning ownership to the flags, because it may be that sort of certain areas of the team aren't aware that they're sort of responsible for a feature flag. So assigning that ownership to them and sort of having someone be responsible for that governance. And then, yeah, like alongside like Jira or sort of whatever you're using for sort of ticket management, sort of surfacing the feature flag there as well, so you can keep track of pull requests that have been closed and status of tickets with feature flags.
Yeah, I think it's important to organize. Just as important to organize your code, to organize your flags and put them into logical buckets, right? So come up with a naming scheme that works for your organization. How our platform really organizes things is we organize flags under the features that your team are building. So if your features have names or short codes or things like that that you can assign to them, then having a short code and then your flag name sort of as a sort of prefix to your flag names can be very useful. Yeah, I think as Kyle said, like assigning ownership is very, very critical. Yeah, the reality with teams, and I think every provider has seen this working with teams with hundreds or thousands of flags in production, is that flags can become tech debt over time, right? Like flags that are just in your code that can disable functionality, maybe core functionality of your application over time when you're not in the development phase of that feature anymore, can cause issues if it's turned off. If you restructure the code to restructure that feature, and the people who maybe wrote the flags originally are not the people who restructured the code, it can definitely cause issues. So as Kyle said, like having a strategy for removing flags over time that are no longer needed is important. Yeah, we sort of believe ourselves that it should be as easy to remove flags from your code as it is to add them, and you should be aware of sort of what flags are being used, what flags are necessary, and maybe what flags are tech debt. But there are always going to be some flags in your code that you're going to also want to have to be long living, like flags that are maybe controlling who gates access to certain features of your product, or long-lived controls that you might need in an emergency to disable, like a caching rate or a polling rate to a certain API endpoint or something like that. Yeah, those are sort of long-lived flags, and you should actually name those differently than the flags you might just be using for a couple weeks to ship a new feature to production. So there are sort of different lifestyles and types of flags that you can use throughout your product.
That's a really good point that I didn't consider in my answer. I think one thing that I've realized about feature flags since starting is knowing when a feature flag is a permanent feature flag, a permanent fixture of your application, because there are examples of that. I think more time than not, the feature flag is used as a safety net for sort of guiding a feature to being stable in production. But there are features that you should be tagging and sort of saying, like, no, this is permanent. Don't never delete this feature flag. It's always useful throughout the duration of the application. And I guess a couple more points to add to that great answer previously is sort of not misusing feature flags as well. So, for example, if you're using a feature flag for a one-line sort of bug fix for every single bug that you create, then you're probably misusing feature flags, and sort of removal of those feature flags becomes confusing. And then also adding too many dependencies and sub-dependencies within feature flags. I'll sort of give an example. If you've got like 4 deeply nested feature flags that all have sub-dependencies and parent dependencies, and you're in that situation with many features, I think it kind of highlights maybe a technical challenge with the actual product that you're developing itself, and you're kind of wrapping yourself up in sort of complexity. So sort of decoupling feature flags, if you're in that position, is often a good thing as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Kyle and Jonathan. So one quick question is, I have 2 follow-up questions. So is it something that you implement on day one? Or is it?
I think the follow-up on Kyle's point is, like, I think you always want for the feature that you're building to have like one master flag at the top level, right? Which is like enabling this feature. And then you might have like a layer of a bunch of flags underneath that flag that are configuration for that feature. But at day one, you should always kind of have like one top level Boolean probably flag that can turn on or off this feature, right? And then you should probably add some tests too for that flag to ensure that that feature sort of enables or disables correctly. And then a lot of the configuration and other flags for that feature should sort of, you've got to make sure are all sort of below that sort of like top level flag as a real safety measure.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And what Kyle was mentioning earlier around, not around like complexity. So the question is, like, if we're trying to, let's say, balance the need for flexibility against the risk of introducing complexity, and also we don't want to be in a potential technical debt. So how do you balance the flexibility with the complexity that feature flags may or may not introduce?
Yeah, I think this maybe gets into some of the bad use cases for feature flags. Like, I think we've all seen users try to use feature flags as like a database, right? Or as like as a crutch for not using another tool. And I think fundamentally a feature flag probably shouldn't be part of the core business logic of your app. Like, it shouldn't really be controlling like maybe the roles and permissions of your application, or the security layer of like who has access to something. Like that shouldn't be its sort of core use case. It shouldn't replace like what a traditional database or another system can do. And like, that's kind of one of the problems with feature flags, is that there is so much configurability, and you can really run a lot of your runtime logic through feature flags, that people get into a bit of a trap there. And so I think keeping feature flags to just the deployment and runtime configuration of your application to choose who has access to certain features, and be able to potentially modify the functioning of that features for things like experimentation and A/B testing, is what feature flags are good for. But yeah, maybe not for like deep running like the deep logic of your application.
Yeah, it's interesting, this question, because we're answering from almost automatically knowing how the best practices of feature flags. And the answer to this question is all around what we would consider being misusing flags. So complexities from lots of flags, that would mean that you would naturally introduce too many subdependent flags because you're keeping the flags around forever instead of keeping it as clean as possible. Using flags in bad places, such as like database changes, tiny bug fixes. And I guess one thing to mention is the prevention of these issues and these over complexities. And that could be resolved, especially with larger teams, by having peer reviewing around feature flags. But by default, a lot of feature flagging is used by just sort of turning features on and off and adjusting the config. But a lot of the providers will allow you to sort of add a sort of four eyes approval mechanism to the feature flag changes, so that if someone's making the wrong decision around feature flagging, well, prior to releasing the code, I guess it would be caught in the pull request. But post that, it could also be caught in the sort of pull request for feature flagging, if you will. And then, yeah, I mean, there have been crazy use cases before where we've had sort of like people using a feature flag and a JSON blob of remote config that controls their entire site, and sort of their whole site is sort of a CMS under this one massive feature flag of a JSON blob. That would be an example of something that you shouldn't do. And that is quite a complex thing that you should avoid.
Yeah, it's like another challenge that some people might face is like, this is something called feature flag sprawl, you know. So how do you address the challenge of managing that, especially, let's say, you know, when you have so many features that grow over time? What's like the strategy that, you know, from day one you're not going to get overwhelmed in the, you know, coming future as the number of flags grow? What do you do personally?
Yeah, so this answer is probably going to differ and be the extent to where this affects you probably depends on the team size. As a small development group, it's naturally a lot easier to keep on top of these things because you don't have hundreds of developers creating flags on a day-to-day basis. So that naturally becomes a lot easier to sort of control. It's just having a development team that sort of like understands a common practice of like when there are too many feature flags sort of happening, and we should be sort of keeping an eye on removing. Now, with bigger teams, it becomes a whole different thing. And it's all down to governance, accountability, and sort of standardizing a process where you come to remove your flags. Like one easy sort of process I always recommend is setting a time frame heuristic where you recognize flags as being stale, non-permanent flags, that is, because we did say some feature flags could be long-lived, but recognizing a heuristic for when feature flags should be tagged as stale, assigning ownership to those feature flags so those groups, those team members can look at their own stale flags, and then the process of removing them from the code, making sure that the feature flag is no longer used in production or in any environment, and then removing those feature flags. So yeah, the tagging, organization, and ownership all play a part here.
Yeah, I think Kyle nailed most of it, and it really comes down to like, because feature flagging is a development process, it's aligning how you use feature flags to the rest of your development process, right? Like if you're if you're a big organization that has like hundreds of microservices and is under that structure, you're probably going to use feature flagging differently than a large kind of monolith or monorepo style company, right? And that's where I think the integrations and the organization really comes to be important, right? Like how do you integrate feature flagging into your workflow? Because ideally feature flags are something that your development teams are interacting with on a daily basis, right? And so how do you integrate it at the CLI level into how you're sort of setting up feature flags? How do you integrate it into your CI/CD platform so that it's obvious when you add or modify flags as part of your existing workflows? How do you integrate into your task tracking, like Jira style systems, so that it can be just a task that a developer can check off as to add or remove flags as necessary. So that's where the integrations into your existing workflow are really important, and in trying to make like feature flags are a development like workflow, as we talked about, in development practice, and so that means tying into those tools and extending a lot of these, like a lot of feature flag platforms have open APIs, have CLIs, have integrations with GitHub and Circle CI and whatever other platforms you might use to try to make a standardized practice for feature flagging, and even automatically adding and removing flags from your code base based off those stale reminders. So all of that is very important as your team size scale. But for small teams, you don't need that much complexity. I think most small teams can get away with a lot of that process.
Yeah, and speaking of like complexity, and as feature flags grow, like maybe you can also share about what if someone faces challenge with feature flag dependencies. Let's say a behavior of one flag is affecting the behavior of another flag, because it can get quite like a map, if your feature flags grow quite a lot in number. So how do you handle that, the challenge of feature flag dependencies?
It's a good point. Yeah, I think that's where structure of your feature flag platform is important, right? So I think, as we talked about a bit earlier, about having sort of like master level feature flags for a feature, and then dependence beyond that is important. Also, if you're doing, say, experimentation, and a lot of times with experimentation, you want to experiment on audiences that don't overlap, right? So if you're experimenting with a new version for a certain feature, you're running an A/B test, you might want that audience to be distinct from another A/B test you're running, right? And so a lot of platforms allow you to sort of separate those audiences, and to make sure that, hey, anyone who's getting this experiment, this variation for this feature that we're doing, maybe doesn't get this other one, right? And keep those distinct from each other. So that's another way. But I think organization and that hierarchy of making sure that, like, this is the top level sort of feature flag that controls this feature, and then all the dependent flags for that feature are kind of below that is very important. But with any complex software system that teams are building, a lot of times those things will get missed. So that's where also tooling around these platforms, I think, can get a lot better. And a big reason why I think both Kyle and I are invested in OpenFeature is, I think, open tooling that allow you to identify that, hey, the code path for this feature flag conflicts with the code path for this other feature flag, and potentially turning one off will affect the other. And I think there's a lot of work we can do as a community, and especially in open source, to build great tooling around this problem, to identify that, hey, like, these feature flags might conflict. You might want to think about removing this flag and using sort of some open tooling to help you do that. I think tooling is very important to solve this problem.
Yeah, I think that leads perfectly into my initial point. A lot of people transition to using a feature flag provider from having something that vaguely represented it, such as a configuration file, sort of configuration within code versus as a sort of separate tool that's decoupled from code. And what that sort of gives you is actually a visual representation of that coupling, because I think sometimes if you end up being in that position, it could be sometimes a symptom of things at the product level being too complex. And if all of that complexity is in code, you kind of don't have a high level view of that happening. It's just slowly gets worse over time, with sort of like configuration bloat in code, and code becomes unwieldy and sort of hard to maintain. But since feature flagging provides you the ability to see these feature flags, see the descriptions of them, see the sort of history of feature flags being turned on and off, and raising that maybe a feature flag hasn't been used in a long time, so maybe it should be removed, it kind of gives a bit of sort of development sort of insight that would be really hard to track just through code. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Thanks for sharing, Jonathan and Kyle. Jonathan mentioned a bit about OpenFeature. So can you tell the viewers a little bit more about how that is structured and what's the essentially the role, and a little bit more about the org?
Yeah, OpenFeature. I'm sure many people out there have maybe heard of OpenTelemetry. OpenFeature is a similar style project where it's an open interface to feature flagging, right? So it's a kind of vendor agnostic set of SDKs and interfaces that allow you to use the OpenFeature kind of interfaces and SDKs in your code, and then allow you to quickly sort of link the OpenFeature SDK as kind of a proxy to the different providers, right? And so that could be an internal system you have yourself, right? It could be an environment variable file that Kyle was talking about as your initial source of flag values. It could be an open source solution like FlagD or Go Feature Flag or something like that, as a simple source that serves flag values to your OpenFeature SDKs, or it could, and that is a really good starting point for most people. And then as your needs get more complex and as you get into a bigger organization, a vendor like Flagsmith or DevCycle can easily be hooked up to your existing feature flag setup with like a couple lines of code. You basically just plop in the Flagsmith or DevCycle provider into your existing setup, and bang, you sort of have the ability to use all of your existing flags within those platforms. So that's really sort of the goal of OpenFeature, is kind of be that SDK layer, that common interface that everyone can use in their code. So when you're potentially writing hundreds or thousands of flags in your code, you're writing them in an open source, open interface way, and you're not sort of like having to rely on a single vendor sort of interface for that, and then allow you to plug and play different vendors and grow sort of your use case of feature flags over time. So yeah, it's a pretty fast growing project. I've been involved with it for about 2 years. It's been growing pretty quick. We have support for most major sort of back-end languages and front-end languages as SDKs so far. Always looking for contributors. So if you're interested, go to openfeature.dev and check it out. Have lots of examples there too of how to integrate into your products. And I think both Flagsmith and ourselves sort of support it as kind of like a first level integration, right? You can start using DevCycle or Flagsmith today with just OpenFeature as our main interface, and it's fully supported. So yeah, so that's the gist on OpenFeature.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And by the way, yeah, make sure you check out the community and contribute or just share your feedback. But now, since we're almost there with the webinar, before I talk about like some cloud native related topics with feature flags, I think right now would be also a good time for both you and Jonathan and Kyle to talk a little bit more about how you're doing feature flags at your companies, because like for example, there must be many like methods that you have taken as a company to ensure that when people are using feature flags, that let's say they are securely managed and the access control is properly enforced, and the security and all these other things. So Kyle, maybe you can share first how you do feature flags at Flagsmith, and then maybe Jonathan, yeah, you can follow up.
Yeah, so around the security and around controlling who can do what within feature flagging, this is obviously going to depend on the team and what departments a team has. I mean, there have even been sort of new departments created through this sort of feature flag introduction and how much this has disrupted the industry. People like team members dedicated to sort of change management. I would sort of say around this, for example, if you're using single sign-on, sort of like integrate your single sign-on groups with sort of permission groups within the feature flag provider, and sort of, I guess, sort of thinking about who do you want to be responsible for what. It might be immediately sort of a thought, well, the developers are responsible for turning a feature flag on. The developers are responsible for creating a feature flag and creating a sort of a requested sort of change to a feature enabled state. But that's not necessarily the case. And this gives sort of an opportunity through the permissioning to sort of say, hey, the developers, they can create the feature flags and maybe they can make sort of suggested changes to them, but maybe it's actually a totally different team that has the permissions to come and actually approve those sort of changes, especially in highly regulated sort of industries. This gives you a sort of a formalized approach to sort of approving changes and making suggestions and sort of making sure the wrong person doesn't see or be able to edit the wrong feature flag, or sort of targeted based rollouts, controlling what team can sort of have access to sort of targeting a rollout of a new feature to a certain demographic, to internal users, and yeah, that sort of thing. And I think above all else with that, auditing everything. So I think pretty much all of the feature flag providers will be providing audit trails and sort of version history on all of these changes that do happen with the feature flags. So if you do find out too late that maybe the permissioning is wrong and you need to come back and adjust it, you have that audit log to sort of help you identify that.
Yeah, I think one of the things as a feature flag vendor is it's our job to build a lot of the functionality and tooling on top of feature flags that an individual team or a group of developers would never build, right? Like anyone can start with feature flags with like an environment variable or a file that's cached in S3 and just serving some values. And I encourage everyone to start that way or with a simple open source tool. But as you get more complex in your needs and your requirements, a vendor like DevCycle or Flagsmith can help provide a lot of value to build a lot of things that you would never build yourself. Like a lot of companies run into scalability challenges with their feature flag service, and having to run sort of like a service within their Kubernetes cluster that serves like millions or billions of flag values can get difficult, right? And so a lot of us at DevCycle, we've architected the system to be infinitely scalable to any size customer. We've built a lot of functionality like approval stuff that Kyle was telling you about, and things like real-time updates, and a lot of these features that you wouldn't have time to build as sort of an internal team. And for DevCycle, we've really focused on like, how do we make the developer experience as good as possible? How do we integrate deeply into the workflow of how teams are using feature flags on a daily basis? How do we integrate to your IDE, like your VS Code integration, or your GitHub workflow, or your Jira workflow, or all these different sort of modern tools? That's really where we've focused on sort of differentiating our products and trying to tie into how teams actually ship features, right? And one of the core things too at DevCycle that we do a bit differently is we try to help you with that organizational structure, right? Teams are generally building features, not flags, right? And so we try to talk and structure our product in the sense of this is the feature that this team of people are working on, and here are maybe the flags or variables that control that feature kind of underneath it, and try to add that kind of organizational layer that makes a lot of sense for teams that like, hey, this team of 3 people is working on the new checkout flow, and here are the flags that are associated with that, and providing that isolation between features kind of automatically, and also sort of tying into all the various like environments and configuration that your system might have. There's a lot of ways to customize these platforms to fit your workflow, and that's really sort of the job as feature flag vendors, is to fit into how various teams use feature flags and make it a part of their daily workflow. I think you only get value out of a feature flagging platform if it becomes a habit, becomes a core part of how your team ships software to your customers, and that's really the goal of any vendor.
I think maybe one thing to add to that is like to that exact point, you're right. Like as a feature flag sort of vendor, you're sort of a piece of a big puzzle, and it sort of fits into the workflow. So integrating into the like existing tooling is super important. Like like Jira, like GitHub, CI/CD, like analytics platforms, like APM providers. Playing nice with those and having like an open API and being open source all sort of helps along with that, because all sorts of companies have all sorts of different tooling, and if you've got a feature flag provider that doesn't play nice and doesn't sort of share data and utilize those tools, it can be really quite difficult.
Yeah, the future is open standards and open APIs, right? So that's why I think we're both big supporters of OpenFeature and having as much of our platforms be open source as we can.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing, folks. And if you want to check it out, let's go to DevCycle and Flagsmith. Talk a bit more about like feature flags in a cloud native environment, right? How have you seen people, or if you have seen people use it, and if not, then why would you recommend using feature flags in a cloud native environment? What are some of the potential benefits or challenges associated with it?
Yeah, do you mean like how does like feature flags fit into sort of the cloud native deployment? Are you talking more about like maybe like how it fits into like infrastructure as code sort of scenarios, or?
Yeah, I meant infrastructure as code, but another area would be how would you integrate your feature flag management with, let's say, your existing monitoring and alerting systems, for example. That's another use case. Like something goes wrong and then it alerts you, and then you do the rollback using feature flags. So there are two parts to it.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting discussions with DevOps folks and infrastructure developers is always like, what should be kind of a secret, what should be an environment variable, and what should be a feature flag, right? And these feature flags are evaluated at runtime and are dynamic based off user data. There's some things that make a lot of sense for that to be a feature flag, kind of more on the application layer. And then there's some things that are like, you should never have a secret, like a database secret or something like that, be a feature flag, right? Like it's one of the like red lines you should definitely not do. Like we've all seen it happen, but you should not do it, right? And there's certain things that are maybe system level configurations, like maybe controlling, I don't know, how many CPUs that this Go process should have access to. That should be an environment variable, right? Or a secret, not a feature flag, right? That's operated at runtime. So there's kind of a distinct layer there that I think is always good to communicate between sort of the application developers and the infrastructure developers. But there are use cases for feature flags on the backend, and one common use case we see is for kind of deploying new services or new backend changes and rolling those out, right? Like you can use like a simple proxy with a feature flag provider in front of it to in real time control the rollout of like a new microservice, right? And a common practice we see is, say you're writing a new microservice and you want to put it maybe in a comparison mode where you're sort of sending traffic to both the new and old microservice at the same time, and sort of comparing that the results of the new microservice are the same as the old microservice and are returning the same values in production. That's a really good use case for like a runtime feature flag, because that might be something where if it goes wrong, you want to be able to turn it off really quickly, and it's much faster to do that with a feature flag than it is for like a rolling deployment, right? And so I commonly see feature flags used on the back end for those types of sort of migration use cases, but it is probably more commonly used kind of in the API layer of an application, or in the front end sort of like web application or mobile application layer of an application.
There's a couple things that have surprised me around this, starting with feature flags 7 years ago versus sort of now, and I still get surprised at a couple of things. Firstly, the sort of readiness to sort of change often surprises me. Whereas before, sort of deployment hell and maybe cherry picking commits and sort of doing a lot of nasty sort of developer stuff, how much that has sort of changed with feature flagging and being able to sort of change your mind sort of quite quickly. And secondly, I think with feature flagging, it's naturally pushed us towards and maybe encouraged dropping some environments that are not production and investing more in production, because feature flagging gives you that ability to test in production and release code more quickly. So it's quite surprised me how like we've pretty much sort of dropped the use of our staging environment so much here at Flagsmith since we've started. And then as well, for a lot of teams that have so many different sort of deployments of different environments that are all really similar, and I guess not using trunk-based development, but in some cases maybe they are, sort of that getting dropped and sort of money being saved and that money being invested in production.
Yeah,
similar here. We don't use the staging environment pretty much at all anymore.
It's like
either.
It's crazy. Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
like the sort of use of it has dropped down to pretty much nothing. And
we have local environments that obviously developers use, and then we have sort of branch-based environments that get automatically produced when you make a PR, and then we have like a pre-prod environment that runs end-to-end tests, but like no one has access to that environment except for our end-to-end tests, and then everything we test is in prod with feature flags. So yeah, same.
And how have you seen the performance and reliability impact overall?
I massively for me. I mean, and one thing I'll put this down to more than anything is when branches stay around a long period of time, and a lot of code built up in that branch and a lot of conflicts build up in that branch, and the difference between production and wherever you're developing from sort of the distance sort of greatens, that has mainly been that moving away from that has been the biggest cause for fewer bugs for me and greater stability in production. That and testing in production. I'm a massive believer of testing in production. How many times throughout the past 11 years I've seen sort of people be absolutely convinced that a feature works, so convinced on a development environment, and then when it goes to production, either because the data is different or because the code is different, because you've let a feature branch diverge so much, and maybe you're not even using trunk-based development and you've got a big blanket development branch where you've got like loads of other people's sort of features as well, which differs greatly from production. Testing in production just gives you way more confidence, and that leads to greater stability. And then I guess as well, it's not sort of like absolutely 100%. There will still be bugs, but it's the quickness to sort of change and back out and sort of say, okay, that's not ready. We need to go make some changes. Let's switch this feature flag off whilst we diagnose all of that.
Yeah, shipping small, incomplete pieces of code to production and not like having a feature branch that just lives on for weeks. I think every engineer has worked in environments where that's happened, where you just have these giant branches with massive refactors and massive like changes to the code base that just sit for weeks or months. And then one day you have to like bite the bullet and ship it, and everyone dreads that day. I think I know it sounds like for Kyle and for us, like that's just not a thing for us anymore. Like every PR that we're doing continuous deployment, so every PR that's emerged is shipped to production right away automatically, and that's just been such a like relief for our engineering team and such a accelerant for our ability to ship quickly and safely, actually, because like we have very few production incidents from this because it becomes a habit, right? Like you know that you have that feature flag backing you there, and the code that you're shipping that might be just in development, that might be beta code, that might not be ready for the limelight, is behind a feature flag. So you don't have that worry that, hey, this is going to go and break everything, because you've structured your code and set up your code in a way that provides that safety. And it's just a massive accelerant to development teams. And I think goes back to our original point of like, feature flagging or development is a development practice that can really accelerate your team's progress and pace of deployments. And that's kind of the most important message here is trying to get teams to ship more frequently and quickly to production, can unlock all sorts of productivity gains and gains in performance and reliability of your deployments, right? Like your deployments should be pretty much 100% reliable, and shipping much smaller pieces of code to production that are behind feature flags can just naturally make them much safer to deploy. Yeah. Obviously, you want testing, you want end-to-end tests, you want unit tests and all that stuff, but like it just smaller pieces of code that are shipped to production more frequently are inherently safer.
This is ironic where I've seen that governance becomes important, because you're so relaxed and you're so sort of everything's so stable because it's behind the safety net of a feature flag. You've got to have ownership over that feature flag, because if you forget to enable that feature flag, you think your job's done because you've safely released code. You actually still need to enable that feature flag. So because everything's so stable sort of all the time, you've got to remember and assign ownership to that feature flag to make sure that that feature actually gets out.
That's also why getting code to production quickly is important, right? Because you don't want your engineer to like sit around for like a day and be like, oh yeah, I committed that PR and like the release went out 2 days and I've been working on this other code and I forgot about it. But now that it's in prod, I got to go fix it. It's like, if you're shipping small chunks of code quickly to production, then your team, like your engineers, should be responsible for like, oh, I just clicked the merge on that PR. It deployed 5 minutes ago. There's an issue. I'm actually still in the mode of fixing and know how to fix that, rather than these really long release cycles that get in the way of that. So I think that, I think I agree with Kyle. That's a really big point.
Cool. Well, we're almost closing in on our webinar, and we have 180 people watching. So folks, check out DevCycle, check out Flagsmith, check out the links, check out OpenFeature. And yeah, this was really fun. Cool. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Guess we'll see you in the next one.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.